My humies, my humies, my humies. We all know what the perfect shape in the universe is. That is to say, the almighty cube. But I do understand that you humies, you organics, but specifically you humies, have a thing about balls. You do love your balls. You play games with them. You mess around with them. You try to stack them. It's very strange. But we have catered to this particular, psychosis of yours on occasion before, by way of the Union dropship from Battletech and the RB-79 from Gundam. And I suppose, technically, this channel has grown to the point where I can tackle the ball of all balls. That is to say, of course, the Death Star. Any ship left on the dock for more than 24 hours will be compressed to a cube at the owner's expense. Welcome to Sacred Cow Shipyards. Now, as soon as I drop the topic, I am sure there are some humies who would like to point out that there were perhaps bigger balls in science fiction. For example, say Unicron, which is occasionally represented in a ball-shape format. But it's really hard to scale him, her, it, whatever, robot, fine. And it's kind of really hard to talk about because Transformers kind of barely, I don't know. I'm going to say this, I'm going to piss everyone off, and maybe it'll drive some traffic to the channel, but Transformers really just falls into the category of anime for me. And y'all know my feeling about anime, although yes, I will be talking about a certain warship from a certain anime at some point in the future, once my limited positronic network has been able to wrap its circuits around all of that insanity. But Transformers don't really care about reality or functionality or details, so I don't really have much to talk about there. It's like asking me to talk about the TARDIS. It doesn't make any sense. So we're going to ignore that ball. Now, if you want to bring up some other bigger balls, you're welcome to. And maybe we'll talk about those in the future, because like I said, you humies love your balls. But anyways, I suppose I should talk about what the Death Star is and what the Death Star is not. So let's start with what it is. What it is a 160-kilometer diameter sphere of pain. Yeah. Even without getting into the obvious entry of why the Death Star actually exists, there were 12,000 X-ray TAC-9 heavy turbo laser batteries built into the surface of the Death Star itself. 12,000 batteries. And no, I'm not talking about the little cylindrical objects or flat objects or whatever shape they come in objects that you shove into things to give them electrical power without having to plug them into a wall or whatever. I'm talking about a combination of guns, projectile weapons, although in this case projectile is a bit of a strong term, but basically when you slave two or more guns together, they create a battery. That's not actually how it's actually used historically on your planet. A battery is simply a collection of guns, but in Star Wars, mostly they are actually slaved together, in that when one gun is pointing at something, both or all three or all four, or however many guns are pointed at the same target. And yes, I know your culture has problems with the whole master-slave terminology, but you can get over it. Beyond those 12,000 heavy turbo laser batteries, though, there were also 15,000 turret-mounted twin light turbo laser batteries. Okay, so first I have questions because I'm reading the specifications off the actual specification sheet, but the heavy turbolaser batteries were not noted as being turret mounted. I have to assume they are. I hope they are. Ugh. Be kind of weird if they weren't. Would you have to like rotate the entire Death Star to point the batteries at the given target? I don't know. But also, what is a light turbo laser? I mean, I know what a turbo laser is. It's a much, much more powerful laser cannon in the Star Wars universe. Fighters in the Star Wars universe, for example, the X-Wing Starfighter or the TIE Fighter, both use laser guns, laser cannons, whatever they call them. Turbo lasers are the big honkin' ones that big honkin' ships use. So what's a light turbo laser? Is there like an intermediate step between a turbo laser and a laser cannon? Weird. But regardless, we are now up to, I believe the math is 27,000 turbo laser adjacent batteries. Understand that this isn't individual like guns. This is batteries. So we're going to step down from batteries to 10,000 Super Blaster 920 laser cannons. Oh my fornication. Who the hell came up with that designation and why am I rhyming? Look, I'll admit that Star Wars has played fast and loose with the differentiation between blasters and laser cannons. I will never argue that point, and it frustrates me to no end. But deliberately naming a laser cannon the Super Blaster, I would just like 5 minutes with the designer of that weapon in a closed room. Okay, cool. Can anyone arrange that for me? I'd appreciate it. Thank you. We're just going to chat. No big deal. But regardless, if you can't shoot down a given target with all of these thousands upon thousands of turrets and batteries and this, that, and the fornicating other, you've got 10,000 light ion cannons. I don't know how a light ion cannon compares to the ion cannon turrets on top of Y-Wings. I'd guess it's stronger, which makes me wonder why the ion cannons on a Y-Wing are called ion cannons and the ion cannons on the Death Star are called light ion cannons. I have no idea. But the point is, once you disable the target, you've got 1,000 heavy tractor beam projectors to grab said target and pull it into any of its impossible to count number of docking bays and divest it of its organics. Yeah. We ain't done yet, though. We also have 20,000 turret-mounted point defense concussion missile launchers. I just want to take a second, a moment, a time, and deconstruct that phrase. Because for most starfighters, concussion missiles are considered to be, well, starfighter killers. Proton torpedoes are used predominantly against capital ships or really, really slow starfighters, for example, TIE bombers or Y-Wings, for example. But concussion missiles, however, are definitely like the Sidewinder of the Star Wars universe. They go fast, they go hot, and they will knock your ass out. But apparently the Death Star treats them as a point defense system. I guess it's kind of like a counter battery system, where if you launch a proton torpedo at the Death Star, it can just task a point defense concussion missile launcher to knock the proton torpedo down before it gets to the Death Star. Not that it would do a whole lot of damage, but come on. Who wants to go out there and repair that crap? And no, sadly, we are still shockingly not done. I've lost track of how many tens of thousands, possibly even hundreds of thousands of turrets and things we have now. But oh no, we still have turret-mounted twin heavy laser cannons in the count of 50,000 of them. 50,000 twin heavy lasers. Again, I don't really know how heavy lasers fit into the spectrum between laser cannons and heavy lasers and light turbo lasers and turbo lasers, but let's just call that a lot of guns. Okay? Cool. Fine. And to round all this out, we finally get to the 50,000, yes, another 50,000 turret-mounted quad laser cannons. Now, these I do know. These you saw on the Millennium Falcon, among possibly other places. Because the Millennium Falcon, as with a lot of YT-1300 freighters, has a dorsal and ventral turret that mounts each a quad laser cannon turret. So at least in that context, we do have some frame of reference to describe what's going on. Now, one thing I would like to take a moment and point out is, as we mentioned previously, the Death Star itself is approximately 160 kilometers in diameter. Cool. It's approximately spheroid. Let's just call it a sphere, because that makes math much easier. Which means its total surface area is approximately 80,425 square kilometers. Okay, fine. This is all basic math at this point. And technically what I'm about to tell you is also basic math. But I would like to point out that each of those 50,000 turret-mounted quad laser cannons, and that's an absurd number, don't get me wrong, is responsible for covering a square kilometer 0.6 of the surface of the Death Star. Yes, each of those quad laser cannons is responsible for defending 1.6 square kilometers of the surface of the Death Star. Okay. Looping back to those heavy turbolaser batteries, and again, all these numbers are assuming even distribution across the surface of the Death Star, which is probably not accurate for reasons that we'll get into shortly. But regardless, there are 12,000 heavy turbolaser batteries on the Death Star, like we talked about. And its surface area is just barely north of 80,000 square kilometers, which means each turbolaser battery has to cover 6.7 square kilometers of surface. In other words, each turbolaser battery would have to cover an area 2.6 kilometers by 2.6 kilometers approximately, on a sphere that is 160 kilometers in diameter. This is one of the first problems with the idea of the Death Star. In fact, this is one of the first problems with the idea of the Imperial battle doctrine, in that they never believed that fighters mattered. This is why TIE fighters are disposable. This is why a lot of their capital ships don't actually have active fighter defenses built into the capital ships themselves, because they honestly believed that fighters never carried enough payload to make a big enough difference to all these capital ships, despite having experienced so many situations where, oh yeah, no, that definitely happened. But, speaking of, I did actually forget to talk about one specific detail about the defensive measures for the Death Star. Like pretty much every starship, capital ship, fighter ship, aside from the TIE series, and so on and so forth in the Star Wars series, it has shields, obviously. Really good shields, actually. And the cool thing is they actually kind of thought about how shields on something that large could potentially work. You wouldn't have a central shield generator. It would just... The energy necessary to get the bubble out far enough to cover the entire surface of the Death Star would basically just eat the entire reactor by itself. So instead, the surface of the Death Star is actually populated by what are best termed as colonies. There are clusters of shield generators and communications arrays spaced out across the entire surface of the Death Star. So it actually has an interlocking, possibly even self-reinforcing shield system around it. Kind of cool, honestly, when you think about it that way. And then just because we aren't done talking about its defensive capabilities even still yet, yes, even though the Empire basically denigrates, disdains, ignores starfighters, she did actually carry 7,000 of them, ranging from TIE interceptors to TIE advanced to TIE fighters to basically every single variant of TIE you can think of. Also, she carried about 3,600 shuttles of various types, as well as 2,800 AT-series walkers, along with the 1860 landing craft necessary to get those walkers to the ground. And not just walkers, mind you. Not just the men! But actually, mostly men, because the crew complement on the Death Star was somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.2 million personnel. And of those, they had about 340,000 Imperial Navy and Army garrison troopers, and then another 26,000-ish stormtroopers on board. So yeah, those landing craft would be used for the stormtroopers as well. And then, of course, on top of all of that stuff we've already talked about, there is the gigundo glow-in-the-dark elephant in the room, isn't there? That is to say, of course, the Mark I superlaser. The crowning jewel of the Death Star, the entire reason the Death Star was really built, even though the Darksaber technically proved that the rest of the Death Star was kind of superfluous. And no, I'm not talking about the lightsaber, I am talking about the actual superweapon constructed by Crime Lord Durga the Hutt. He basically took the superlaser concept, pared it down as far as they possibly could and turned it into a terrifying super capital ship. It didn't exactly last very long, but then again, neither did the Death Star, so, you know. And yes, as anyone who knows anything about Star Wars knows, the super laser is more than sufficient to destroy basically any planet in the Star Wars galaxy. It certainly took care of an Earth-type planet with barely a single blast. It made a scarring gash on both Jeddah and Scarif on a single reactor burst, which is kind of a strange phrase because the Death Star only has the one reactor. In fact, it's basically the largest hypermatter annihilation reactor built in the Star Wars universe to that date. It's the same basic reactor design as the bubble you find on the bottom of Star Destroyers. The Empire really loves their hypermatter annihilation reactors, and they are somehow more advanced than antimatter annihilation reactors for reasons and specifics that Star Wars never goes into. Now, what they might be referring to when they say reactor ignition is they might actually run the reactor on a very low level for normal operations of the Death Star, and then shut it down, and then deliberately spark it hot to get it started up again to funnel all the excess energy into the super laser. It's hard to say. It's Star Wars. They play fast and loose with everything. It is worth noting that the Death Star super laser is a collimating laser in the worst possible way possible, in that it combines the output of 8 emitters around the dish of the super laser weapon, and then a single solid beam coming out of the center of the dish. Because that's how lasers work. If you point them at each other, they all join up at the point where they intersect, and then they go the same direction, right? Totally how lasers work. Yep. And of course, all of these crazy laser mechanics, naturally, given Star Wars, requires kyber crystals, which after all is why the Empire was functionally raping Jeddah. They were gathering up as many kyber crystals as they could to power and route the power for the Death Star super laser. And naturally, since this super laser could take out planets with relative ease, knocking out Mon Calamari cruisers and basically any other capital ship out there was trivial. You could probably do single reactor bursts, whatever the hell that means, again, on capital ships and be able to recycle faster and get shots off faster and just take out an entire fleet from distance. I mean, granted, the weapon is quite terrifying. You do have to turn the entire station to aim it, which is a little bit of a detail, yes, but this is Star Wars and they have inertial dampeners and this, that, and a fornicating other, so it doesn't really matter in the end. But that brings us to what the Death Star is not. And what it was not was a good idea. Yes, I am all aware and formally introduced to the concept of the Tarkin Doctrine, the notion that you can rule a galaxy-spanning empire through fear and state terrorism. And generally, that could work. I would note that the Star Wars series of movies proves that it doesn't, but that's a different topic entirely. And when I say it wasn't a good idea, I'm not even actually referring to the exhaust port one-shot kill method that was snuck into its design. I mean, the Empire obviously didn't know about that, so there wasn't anything they could do about that. But even if that didn't happen, it was still not a good idea. Let's look at this from the opportunity cost side of things to begin with. By all accounting, and it's kind of hard to say because the Death Star changed so many hands, it was actually technically started during the Republic. Because, after all, the Republic, like all galaxy-spanning governments, had a hard-on about, super weapons. Who doesn't love a super weapon? But the construction of the Death Star actually did start during the Clone Wars. This was shown during the movies when the plans were handed off to Count Dooku. Well, yeah, those plans were acted upon, and construction started about 21 years before the Battle of Yavin. But regardless, this makes the accounting of its cost rather challenging, given that there was a whole military coup in there somewhere. I'm sure a lot of records got lost, and I'm sure a lot of people went home with a lot of interesting golden parachutes and so forth and so on. So it's hard to say. But regardless, if we take an approximate number as over 1 trillion galactic credits as a baseline, well, let's look at what else we can get with 1 trillion galactic credits, huh? For about that same price, you could get 6,667-ish Imperial Star Destroyers. Either variant, 1 or 2, doesn't really matter, they cost about the same. 7,000 Star Destroyers. I hate to break it to y'all, but the Death Star can only be in one place at one time. And in fact, it does not get around very quickly. I mean, granted, it does have something like 123 sublight engines, and it has a hyperdrive, of course, but it's only a Class 4. That's not very fast. For reference, the Imperial Star Destroyers themselves have a Class 2 hyperdrive, and the X-Wings have a Class 1 hyperdrive. And as a reminder, Star Wars hyperdrive ratings, the lower the number, the faster the ship goes while it is going faster than light. It's unclear whether this is a linear scale or a logarithmic scale or how the particular details work, but suffice to say, smaller number faster. Now, 7,000 Imperial Star Destroyers is not enough to put a Star Destroyer in orbit around every single significant habitable planet in the Star Wars galaxy, granted. And yeah, the Death Star showing up in orbit around your planet will put a chill down your spine. Much more so than an Imperial Star Destroyer. However, if 10, 20 of them show up in orbit, you'll start paying attention. But Dockmaster, I can already hear you saying, the Death Star can one-shot a planet. You're not wrong. I can't argue with that point. But it can only do that to one planet at a time. And worse than that, you are wasting all the materials of that planet. I mean, you're technically making a new asteroid field, so I guess technically you could go into the asteroid field and extract whatever materials or minerals you want, and so forth and so on. But asteroid field mining is a pain in the ass. Why not keep all the minerals and materials in one place? Because I'm going to let you in on a little secret here. Despite the fact that Star Destroyers are called Star Destroyers, they're not really capable of destroying stars. They are, however, capable of implementing Base Delta Zero. For those Warhammer 40,000 fans out in the audience, Base Delta Zero boils down to the simplest and cheapest exterminatus available: orbital bombardment. And the funny thing is, it wasn't even the Empire that came up with the idea. General Grievous pioneered the concept on his capital ship, the Invisible Hand, by orbitally bombarding the planet of Humberine until not only was no one left alive on the planet, but the entire crust had melted. Now, pop quiz. How long did that take him to do? I mean, his Invisible Hand is actually smaller and less powerful than the average Imperial Star Destroyer. Has fewer guns, it's like 2/3 the length of one, significantly less mass. Took him a long time, right? Nah. His one ship was able to cauterize, not even just cauterize, melt an entire planet in an hour. 1 hour. Think about how terrifying that would have to be on the planet. Think about how terrifying that would have to be to watch. And an ISD is larger. It can definitely do it in an hour. So, tell me which is more functional for the concept of ruling by fear. One-shotting a single planet or melting 7,000 simultaneously. Because, oh sure, it doesn't actually take the Death Star superlaser an hour to recharge from even a full 8-reactor shot. But again, hyperspeed Class 4 drive. It's going to take it a second to get from system to system, man. It even takes it a second to get around inside of a system by itself. Even at sublight speeds, that dang thing is not very fast. But you can pre-position 7,000 Star Destroyers and just start glassing planets, one after the other. Broadcast it live over the Imperial News Network so everyone can see what you're doing. And tell the planet next on the list that, hey, you are in fact next on the list unless you do this. How many planets do you think would hold out? Not that many. And sure, the planets you might want to target might have their own adequate defenses to hold out against a single Imperial Star Destroyer. So fine, send 7 Imperial Star Destroyers to 1,000 planets. We're still doing a whole hell of a lot more terror than one-shotting a single planet. But that brings me back to the Death Star again and why the design was simply not great. Yeah, okay, super laser, cool, awesome, you got that. How many hundreds of thousands of turbo lasers, ion cannons, concussion missile launchers, whatever else did we count dotted across its surface? Imagine if, instead of dedicating so much energy to the super laser, you simply ripped out that entire assembly and just put on more turbo lasers. Imagine that thing just slowly spinning over your planet as every single turbo laser battery comes to bear on your planet and just probably actually breaking it apart. Because there are documented instances in the history of Star Wars where a single Imperial Star Destroyer was able to blast through a planet's crust and destroy its core. It took a little while, granted, but Again, the scale difference between a Star Destroyer and the Death Star is rather significant. I bet if it focused all turbolaser turrets on a single hemisphere onto a single point on a single planet, that planet would not be around for very long regardless. Now yes, I know what I'm doing. I know that I'm basically comparing and contrasting the firebombing of Tokyo that transpired on 10 March 1945 as opposed to the nuking of Nagasaki on 9 August 1945 on your planet. One of those ended the war. One of those did not. One of those required all of 6 aircraft to accomplish. The other required over 300. However, one important detail I would like to point out is that the casualties from one was much higher. And it's not the one you think. Yes, you heard that right. Mostly due to the construction of Tokyo at the time, the Tokyo firebombing resulted in somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 30,000 more casualties than the nuking of Nagasaki, as bizarre as that is to say, and probably is to hear. But again, there's something very, very different about a single aircraft flying over your city, dropping a single bomb, and that entire city going away, as compared to hordes and fleets and swarms of bombers dropping all the bombs and your city burning to ash. Very different psychological impact upon you squishies, which I suppose is why Tarkin went with the one-shot kill of a planet, rather than 7,000 Star Destroyers. I still say it's a bad plan, but Tarkin went and got himself killed before he could snag a memory engram off of him, so I guess we'll never be able to hash it out. More's the pity. Either way, you can rest assured that the Empire had one gigantic ball. And that's all from Sacred Cow Shipyards. Please be advised that any ship left on the docks for more than 24 hours will be compressed to a cube at the owner's expense. Have a nice day.